So today I feel like we need to have a conversation about Black lives, value, and belief. Within the United States and its history, there has been a long, complicated struggle for people of color to even have a seat at the table. You look at the BLM movement and the idea that Black Lives Matter. BLM is some sort of radical position in the United States. The idea that Black lives have value and meaning and worth is somehow a radical perspective in the United States. And that when voices of the unheard rise up in protest and their allies come out in protest, and people speak to this perspective that Black lives do indeed matter, the response has been police overwhelmingly swarming people of color and trying to put people down. When I think about this in the context of all of the other news stories that I've been covering and all the other things I've been seeing, it just makes it apparent just how much people of color do not and may never have, honestly, a seat at the table in the white supremacist institution that is the United States. I was looking and thinking about this GameStop situation with the stocks. And, when you think about value, when you think about how value is determined, it's all pretty much based on faith. At the end of the day, ignoring all the details behind it and the supply and demand and everything like that, it's faith that a certain perspective, a certain drive, a certain push is going to create a specific set of outcomes. And those outcomes determine something valuable and fair. And the truth is that if value is based around faith, what value and faith do we have in the lives and stories of people of color in the United States? Barely any, I'd argue. It's quite apparent to me at the very least that when we talk about people of color, we talk about their stories, their narratives, it is only useful in so much as white people can make money off of it, that white people can gain something from it, that the white supremacist institution can take further advantage of it. In the history of the United States, going all the way back, you have a history of white people coming in and displacing indigenous populations off their land, destroying communities, destroying culture, destroying cultural dances, destroying everything in order to make room for white people. And what did the white people want to do on that land? Extract wealth, extract resource, mistreat the land, and bring slaves in to do that work for them. And this goes through the history of manifest destiny, all the way through poll taxes and literacy laws and Jim Crow. It goes through the eugenics movements and all the things that happened in Puerto Rico and everything that occurred over there. It goes through to not bombing certain facilities that the Nazis had in World War II. It goes through redlining and gentrification, the denial of access of Black Americans to things like the GI Bill. And, basically saying the suburbs are not for you. It's when banks would deny Black people overwhelmingly, but people of color in general, access to loans, access to resources to say, we value you, we value your life, we value you as an investment. We value you creating a home and a life in an institution. When people talk about racism, like the deep systemic stuff, this is the stuff they're talking about. This is the history that goes into it. And every small anecdotal story, every small bit of evidence compounds and compounds and compounds into a story and narrative that talks about a deep, rich ignorance of white people and their supremacy and making that normal at the cost of the value and lives of people of color. When we look at the idea of separate but equal in the country, and how the idea of equality often meant that the bathrooms for people of color weren't taken care of quite as well, when we look at the way that people of color schools were not funded properly, we always have to, take into account that separate but equal is never truly equal. And that there's populations in the US right now to this day who would absolutely love to restore as many of those institutions as possible. And they have found ways in the differing aspects of life and reality to, codify the same institutions that they've wanted since the beginning. The struggle that people like King and Huey Newton spoke out against, where you had this whole civil rights movement and the call for actual economic justice, for things like reparations, for things like an acknowledgement of the history of things that actually transpired in this country, of everything from, the plantation system all the way through the redlining and gentrification and everything that has come through in between. People of color have had to fight for every tooth and nail of acknowledgement that their story is believable. And when we come to today and Black Lives Matter and the position and perspective that the police needs to be defunded because people of color have trauma, that Black people especially have trauma around the police in their own neighborhoods, coming in and disproportionately just causing harm and destroying lives, whether it be from an actual death or whether it be from the mass incarceration system and the prison pipeline and everything in between. The amount that had to be fought for, the amount of academic work and statistics that had to be put into it before people of color were believed even remotely on these stories, and conservatives still give backlash to this. White supremacists still fight against this. When they talk about how public schools are, one of the safest places for people of color, and there's a constant push for more and more private institutions that consistently shift for white people to be able to buy their ways into them. People with money and wealth and status to buy their way in. And they'll give people, a small amount of, thing now. Like they'll throw a few people of color into the mix so they don't look racist. But that doesn't mean the underlying issue isn't racist. In a lot of cases, there was the whole idea that when Obama took office, that black people had somehow reached the point, and we know that's not the case. One or two people of color making it doesn't change the system. One or two conservative Black people advocating from that perspective and negotiating their own struggle and negotiating their own, Blackness or person of colorhood within the United States doesn't change the whole perspective that the systems and institutions in play are themselves white supremacist and adhere to certain practices. When a bank denies a person of color a loan and a white person walks in right after and gets a loan, that's a problem in this country. And it has been for years. It's a problem of value. It's a problem of respect. It's a problem of life. Because the fact of the matter is Black people and people of color, indigenous people, Latino people, are not valued in the United States. They're just not. And again, people have gotten more gains over the years from constant fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. But I think what really has struck me in the worst way is actually the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. For one, the response to AOC has been one of constant dismissal of Cori Bush, of all of them, all of the squad, when they've talked about the struggles they've faced. When the Trump administration had the Muslim ban in place, when the entire perspective on, people coming in from the southern border was they were rapists and murderers. And AOC spoke against that and spoke against the children in the border camps that are still there, mind you, still there. Biden administration hasn't dealt with that. When you deal with that reality that people of color are not believed, that they are constantly told that they are being too much for expressing their needs, their trauma, their realities, that it's not backed up in science, and yet you can have a bunch of people in the Capitol who believed in the wildest conspiracy theories. When you have a congressperson literally talking about some of the wildest theories. And the QAnon types and all of the stories they created to create this whole narrative and structure. And that got believed enough within white circles. The voter fraud thing got believed in white circles like that. And it led to that insurrection. So, you had this very easy belief of all of these wild stories. But when a person of color says, I have trauma about going outside because the police in my neighborhood are not my friends, and we need to defund them, we need to talk about police brutality, that's denied. When AOC talks about her trauma as a woman of color, in fear that her fellow Republican congresspeople and Senate members, the people who make up that Congress, when she talks about how she fears for her life because of them being in that space, she is not believed. This is not being called into account. And I'm just getting sick and tired of living in a reality where the voices of people of color, the stories of people of color, the narratives that people of color experience are not being believed. Where the lives of people of color are not being valued. Because that is not a society I want to live in, especially as an anarchist. I want to live in a reality where everyone's perspective is taken with value and dignity and respect. And that's going to mean a lot of healing in this country and a lot of addressing the wounds of white supremacy. That's going to mean things like reparations. That is going to mean listening to people of color and putting their stories first. That is going to be allowing white people to have to say and admit Indigenous lives matter, Black lives matter, Latino lives matter, people of color lives matter. We need to start saying it. We need to start believing it. It needs to be true, and the stories need to be taken into account and believed. If you can believe some sort of QAnon stuff, if you can believe any of that, if you can call any of that, or you can even say that white people are coming out in droves to believe that kind of thing, you need to start believing people of color, because when their stories come out, when their lives, their value, their meaning is constantly called into question, it is a white supremacist problem that is representative of institutional issues from the foundings of this country. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter. You can check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara. And I just need it said, more than anything else, we need to listen to more voices of people of color. Have a good day.